You are listening to Wycombe Sound. I'm Bob Johnson. This is an election special where I am interviewing the candidates who are standing for election in the Beaconsfield constituency. We've already heard tonight from the Labour Party's Alexa Collins. Coming up at 7 o'clock, I will be speaking to Zoe Hatch from the Green Party. But next, it is the turn of the independent candidate, Dominic Grieve.
I was born in Lambeth in London, although I think that was only because it was in Lambeth Hospital. My parents lived in West London at the time, and I was brought up in West London in Hammersmith, and went to school there as a little boy, and then I eventually went to Westminster School, which is just behind Westminster Abbey. So I had a period there from the age of 13 to 18 before going to university. So very much a London-based childhood.
Okay, and what did you then do study-wise, university, and then going on into work?
My great passion was history. That's what I enjoyed most at school. And so I went to university to Oxford, and I read history at Magdalen College and got my degree. But I always knew that I needed to have a professional base. And my father, who was a barrister, encouraged me, although he didn't sort of try to guide me into it, but he said that being an independent professional barrister was a very interesting career. He'd enjoyed it. And so I then came back to London and went to the Central London Polytechnic, and I did a converter course to law, and eventually I became a barrister, and I started practice in a mixed common law chambers, as they're called, general common law, doing a huge range of family work, crime, landlord and tenant, bit of property, contract, and practiced at the bar in all for 17 years, full-time, before I was elected for Beaconsfield in 1997.
When did you first start getting into politics? Has it been a lifelong thing, or was it later on?
I think it started really at university. When I was at university in the 1970s, it was a very bad time for our country. For those who remember it, the lights used to go out and you used to go to bed with candles. And there was a very strong sense that the country was failing economically, failing to do itself justice, and in some ways was threatening to fall apart socially. And that's what motivated me into politics. And it was quite an exciting time because it led to Mrs. Thatcher's victory in 1979. And I was involved in the University Conservative Association. We used to go out and leaflet the Cowley works at 6 o'clock in the morning when the night shift came off. And I found politics fascinating. But I also wanted a career first. When I was in London studying for the bar and actually had just become a barrister, somebody suggested I stood for the local council in Hammersmith and Fulham, and I became a councillor in 1982. And so I had 4 years as a councillor, and during that time I also got on the Conservative Party's candidates list and fought a seat in 1987 in Lambeth Norwood, which was a hopeless seat, but took in Brixton. It was a very educational and interesting experience, particularly in diversity issue terms.
Yes, I would imagine, particularly as being the Conservative candidate in that area.
Yes, and it was an area which had changed a lot, and the local Conservative Association probably hadn't kept pace with that change, and my arrival, I think, provided an opportunity to try to broaden its base and campaign in areas where previously they'd just given up. So I did find, I was there during the Brixton riots of '86, and I served on the Police Community Consultative Group. And I enjoyed that immensely. Then I went back to the bar, got married in 1990, tried to find a seat to fight in 1992, but didn't, so I helped John Major's campaign team during the course of the election. And then come 1997, when my practice at the bar had really begun to develop, I was 40, and I was beginning to think that I would never get a seat to fight in Parliament, or to get into Parliament. And at that stage, I told my wife that the 97 election had been called, and I said, quite frankly, I'm going to take a few days off to help the party. We're going to lose this election quite badly. I will then give up my political ambitions and concentrate on being a barrister. I think she was rather pleased about that because she's a barrister as well. And we'd only, 24 hours after I'd had that conversation, I learned that Beaconsfield was seeking a candidate at the last minute. I was summoned down from a short holiday over Easter in the Lake District, and in 36 hours I was interviewed, went through a round, and then selected by the association in early April, and 3.5 weeks later I was the Member of Parliament.
So for your wife, in a space of maybe just over 48 hours, she went from thinking, well, okay, I know exactly what our future's going to be now, to suddenly, oh, okay, I'm now going to be married to a member of parliament.
Yes, and while she was very supportive, I think she was also quite apprehensive about what that would mean. And indeed, she's had some reason to be, because being an MP is a very demanding job. And in terms of one's family life, it is undoubtedly very disruptive.
Have you ever moved to the constituency?
I had a period of 13 years where, as well as my house in London, I had a cottage near Marlow. So we used to come out and use the cottage at weekends. I would come out on a Thursday night and I would do my Friday surgeries. The family would join me and we would spend time over the weekend in the constituency. And the children loved it. I had two little boys at that stage. When I kept that for 13 years, but when I became Attorney General in 2010, the workload became really overwhelming, and I realised that I was really using the cottage as a sort of bunkhouse on a Thursday night and sometimes a Friday night, and I couldn't justify retaining it. So since then I've commuted out, which I don't find difficult, and it usually takes about 35 minutes to the old Beaconsfield office I had against the traffic from my house in London. And in fact, parts of the constituency are closer to my house in London than they are to the other end of the constituency. So it's pretty easy to do, and I get out here as the MP virtually every Friday all day, and then I will be out at weekends, Saturdays and Sundays when Parliament's sitting, depending on what, and also in holiday time, depending on what the social engagements might be, or community activities.
What are the important issues in Beaconsfield at the moment? When you're knocking on doors, what are people saying to you?
Brexit's undoubtedly the dominant issue because, in a way, it's the overarching issue that colours everything else. If Brexit doesn't work well, and obviously I have my views on the likely success of Brexit, then we are going to be impoverished. If we're impoverished, then we can't deliver the public services that people want unless we massively raise taxes or borrow more money. The best way of delivering better public services is to create more wealth. So for obvious reasons, this is the absolutely dominant issue at this election. It's not just are we leaving the EU? And it's what's going to happen over the coming 12 months. Will we get a free trade agreement? Because the idea that Brexit's going to be done on the 31st of January is completely wrong. It isn't. It's just the start of another stage of the Brexit process. And what will the consequences be for the country economically? Will we prosper on it or will we not? And as I happen to think that we won't, that we're doing ourselves an enormous amount of self-harm economically, my concern is that we won't then have the funds necessary to deliver the public services. People are troubled about public services, and they're right to be. Whether it's the NHS, whether it's the state of potholes in the road, people feel that there is more public money that could properly be spent on improving their environment, or for that matter, protecting them. Well, I've been chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, protecting them on defence issues. All this is true, but ultimately the money has to come out of the taxpayer's pocket or be borrowed, and borrowing is not easy. So those are the main national issues. There are some local issues. Greenbelt is a big issue. The government has set housing targets, which is forcing the district councils, as they would see it, to take Greenbelt land away out of Greenbelt and build on it. And in Bourne End and in Beaconsfield, those are both intensely controversial issues. And I have every sympathy indeed with the local residents because their environments are going to be significantly changed. And I'm supportive of the two groups, both in Beaconsfield and Bourne End, who are bringing legal challenges to try to ask the question whether the government's actually got its statistics and the councils got their statistics right about the housing need. But it is clear that there is a housing need, because I know this when people come in to see me at my surgeries. The problem is that the principal housing need locally is for social housing, and that's the one thing which I have a concern may not be provided in sufficient quantities in any development. So it's people needing houses to rent. These are big local issues, and if you see people who've been here for 3 or 4 generations who cannot get somewhere to live because of house prices, private rental not being too expensive and not having nowhere to go, it is very troublesome. Other issues locally, you've got Heathrow Airport, which there's divided opinion. It's worth bearing in mind there's about 750 people in the constituency who work there directly, and probably another 5,000 who are essentially economically dependent on Heathrow. But if a third runway gets built, then it is going to have an impact, particularly down in the Ivor area. My view is it cannot be built if it can't meet its emissions targets, and I have some doubt they will be able to do that. But if they can, then what we need is the infrastructure investment and the environmental improvements that could come with money being unlocked for this. And it could, in fact, lead to a place like Ivor being better at the end than it is today. But it's a very big challenge. And for somebody who's living in Ivor, particularly down at the southern end of the parish, close to Heathrow Airport, they're understandably very worried. Elsewhere in the constituency, opinions will be more mixed. We have HS2, which I continue to think does not deliver value for money. I'm against it, not because I'm necessarily against building a railway, and even with the environmental consequences of doing that. The consequences of building a railway will be less than building the M40, and nobody's ever asked me to plough up the M40 as yet, although it would you might find it rather transformational if it was. So on HS2, it's not so much the environment, it's just, I think, 100 billion, which is where we're heading to on this railway line. I really question whether this could not be better spent on other infrastructure investment.
Back in 2017, when you were campaigning, you did say quite clearly that you would respect the result of the referendum. Is there any form of Brexit that you would now accept?
Clearly, if Theresa May had been able to deliver what she set out in the Conservative manifesto of 2017, and indeed in those speeches which she made at Lancaster House and in Florence, I would have supported it. That's why I signed up to the 2017 manifesto. I did it, I have to accept, with some reluctance, in that I still, although I've tried very hard to see the silver lining to the Brexit cloud, I've never found a rational argument for what we're doing. But what she sought to do and set out in the 2017 manifesto was a bold vision for the future, and had it been deliverable, I would have voted for it, because out of respect for the 2016 result. And I voted to trigger Article 50, I voted to pass the Withdrawal Act. So I did those basic building blocks to take us out. But by the end of last year, I'd come to the conclusion that the deal that she had was so utterly different from what she was trying to get, and also so utterly different from what was being promoted by the Vote Leave campaign in 2016. It was then I said, not we must not go, but I think we ought to go back to the public and put this deal to them and offer them the choice if they want to change their mind. I don't think in a democracy you can fault people for wishing to change their opinions. They do it all the time. And if you start turning a referendum result into a sort of tablet of stone, which you cannot under any circumstances alter the outcome, I think you're losing sight of the very merit of democracy, which is that democracy is constantly having a dialogue between people of trying to improve their conditions. So that's why I changed at the end of last year to advocating the second referendum. That's why I voted against her deal. Although even then, it's right to say that had my ERG colleagues said that they were prepared to sign up to her deal so that there was a certainty she could get it through, I told her I would reconsider my position. But as they were implacably opposed to it for rather different reasons than I was, I said, well, in those circumstances, I'll stick to my guns and continue to argue that we ought to have that referendum. And that's really been my position ever since. It's what I've been trying to achieve over the last couple of months on a cross-party basis until the election was called. And were I to be elected as an independent MP, then obviously it would depend on whether Boris Johnson has a overall majority or not. But if there was a possibility of arguing for a further referendum, I would continue to make that case.
I think you mentioned the Leave campaign back in 2016. There is clearly a trust issue at the moment with regards to the electorate and politicians. Do you think that there should actually be some legislation introduced so that during an election campaign and during a referendum campaign, things that are said have to in some way actually then happen, or there are consequences?
I think that's quite a difficult thing. If you look back over my, as I said, my time in politics, I've been in the House of Commons for 22 years, but longer. Politicians frequently make commitments in manifestos which they prove to be incapable of implementing. and dare I say it, I think the public are entitled to a healthy dose of cynicism. There's a healthy cynicism about politicians' promises because they're often poorly thought through, often not properly costed. And we're seeing that with this election on some of the economic promises being made by both parties, but particularly Labour. And therefore, when the time comes, they prove to be impossible to carry out. But that doesn't mean to say that those politicians are lying at the time they make the promises. They may be their aspirations. What I do find much more worrying about current politics is I think there's a section of the public that now believes that politicians just routinely lie in order to ingratiate themselves with them, and then they have never had any intention of carrying out what they're saying. And that's much more corrosive and more worrying. But if you try to introduce a law that politicians had to implement what they'd said in a manifesto, I think you would run into an impossibility factor pretty quickly. So I'm afraid, ultimately, as Churchill said, democracy is the least bad form of government available, and you have to accept that if people want to throw politicians out at elections, that's their moment to do it, and otherwise they have to elect them and give them a reasonable period of time to try and show what they can do.
I think speaking to the former Attorney General, that's probably as definitive answer as I'm going to get about that one. So thank you very much for that. With regards to Parliament, would you be sitting as an independent? Let's assume that it runs its course and it lasts 5 years this time. Would you be sitting as an independent for the whole 5 years?
Yes, I would. It seems to me that if I stand as an independent, I have then to sit as an independent. Some people have worried that I might take the Conservative whip back again. Obviously, in different circumstances, I might not have lost the whip. But if I'm elected as an independent, I might choose at times to vote with the government if I think the government's doing the right thing, but I will not take the whip back. I think if I were to get to a point where I had to take the whip back or wanted to, then I think I'd have to step down and trigger a by-election so people could express their point of view about that. So I would sit as an independent. And it is real independence, because although I've worked on a cross-party basis with Labour, Lib Dems and Conservative colleagues in the last 12 months, I have no intention, for example, of helping facilitate getting Jeremy Corbyn into Downing Street. I would regard that as being a disaster for the country. I can see circumstances in which I might support setting up a government of national unity if that's what was needed to deliver government, although I suspect such a government would be quite short-lived and would be mainly for the purpose of delivering a second referendum, if that were possible. And as I said, I would also support a Conservative government at times if I consider that what they were doing merited support, but I will remain independent.
Have you heard at all from the Liberal Democrats, clearly, that they have stood aside in the election? Have they been in touch with Dominic Grieve to see if you would be interested in joining them?
They have never suggested it. Clearly, in the end period of the last Parliament, which has just come to an end, a number of my colleagues made decisions to join the Liberal Democrats. Sam Gyimah, who's now fighting Kensington, and Philip Lee, who's fighting Wokingham for the Liberal Democrats. I was never comfortable with that. Not that I don't have a very good working relationship with Liberal Democrat colleagues, and I did in the House of Commons, but I have my own views, and I think they're pretty well established. And it seemed to me that the better course of action was to stand as an independent. I'm very grateful to the Liberal Democrats for not putting a candidate up, and indeed many of them, of their membership in the constituency, are actively campaigning for me. But they are not the only ones actively campaigning for me. I have people who previously voted Labour. I have lots of people who previously voted Conservative. Indeed, some people who've been members of my association until quite recently and have resigned. So I've got a pretty big spread of support. And I will undoubtedly work closely with the Liberal Democrats if I get elected. And there are some matters, such as Brexit, on which we undoubtedly see largely eye to eye, although I don't agree with Joe Swinson's position on revocation without a referendum, which I don't think would be right. But as it's most unlikely that that will arise, I suspect we will be on the same page when it comes to holding a second referendum.
We live in very interesting political times, particularly within the House of Commons, partly which I think has been caused by the Fixed Terms Parliament Act. How do you feel about that act?
I think the act should have been sunset claused. It was set up for the specific purpose of dealing with the coalition between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats in 2010. And the sensible thing would have been to bring it to an end. We should have sunsetted so that it came to an end afterwards. I do think it's acted as a distortion. And the Westminster political system, in the way it should normally work, I think has lost some element of flexibility as a consequence. So although I freely admit that in the last 6 months, I've made use of it in trying to get a second referendum. The fact that no election could be called until it finally happened in last month was, I think, at times useful to me, or at least those people who I was working with who wanted a referendum. I would look, I think, quite favourably to the repeal of that legislation, because it does strike me that it has removed a degree of flexibility which, with our current system, doesn't work well. That said, there is a bigger question mark in my mind about proportional representation. Over the last 6-7 years, I've come increasingly to the view that if you don't have a two-party system, which we don't have anymore, then not having PR introduces really serious skewing into the way in which politics works, and also deters lots of people from participation. And I would be in favour of some form of proportional representation. Once you have that, then of course you get much more coalition government, a much greater willingness to compromise, and ironically, at that point, the Fixed Term Parliament Act probably matters rather less.
You partly did my job for me earlier on when you went through all of the local issues. There's a couple that were on my list that you didn't cover. First of all, the grammar school situation in Buckinghamshire. How do you feel about the slightly alternative setup that we have here?
It's an alternative setup that attracts lots of people to move into this county because it does deliver high quality education. And I'm a great believer as a politician that if something does good in its own context, to start tinkering and interfering with it is not very sensible. Now, the issue, however, is can we, with a grammar school system, deliver high quality secondary education outside of grammar schools? And there the position in the constituency is mixed. You have an example like Great Marlow School, which is an outstanding secondary academy delivering really good quality education for children, some of whom didn't do or failed the 11 plus. Equally, if you just go outside Slough, I've had a school, Burnham Park Academy, which has failed very badly despite good intentions, has finally closed. Children now being bussed off to Bourne End. And that highlights to me that there are some quite serious potential problems in the system. My other schools, Beaconsfield School, is good, and children who go to Chalfont Community College, I think, get a very good educational standard. I think there are a couple of things that we need to look at. Firstly, where the system's working well, if you go down to Marlow, you will immediately find that, in fact, at sixth form level, indeed at other levels, there's very close working between Borlase and Great Marlow School. Pupils will go from one school, students, to another for certain of the classes. I also think that we need to be more flexible about the 11 plus, and we need children develop at different ages. And I think that there may be greater arguments for transference as you go up through the secondary school system. And thirdly, we need to make sure that the secondary academies we've got are good and are providing relevant and helpful education. That, of course, in part depends on the feeder primary schools. And here again, we have mainly the standard at the moment is good, but occasionally we get, even in Leafy Beacon, Leafy South Bucks or Wycombe, you get schools which are not performing properly. It's often to do with leadership, although sometimes there are other issues. And of course, schools have very different catchments. And if you have a very deprived catchment, and there are some areas of deprivation in this constituency, then you have bigger challenges. But broadly speaking, if you aggregate everything together, Buckinghamshire delivers high quality education overall. So that's the reason why I would not interfere with it. It's not that I think grammar schools have some magical quality, but the fact that Buckinghamshire fought hard to retain them when Labour tried to get rid of it, I think they've shown that they were justified in what they did.
You mentioned the areas of deprivation in the constituency. How do we address the rise in the use of food banks?
It's an interesting issue because when we're looking at food banks, it's worth bearing in mind that the unemployment rate in this constituency is minute. It's almost non-existent. So the users of food banks tend to be out of the economically active zone altogether. And my experience is that they tend to end up in with food banks because they're unable to balance their budget. Often it's not that welfare payments leave you reasonably off, they don't, but they often have other reasons around the edges which have created the economic problems, which mean that they can't even depend on the welfare benefits they're getting. They're variables. Sometimes they're bureaucratically inflicted, which causes me great anxiety. So essentially people have their benefits stopped for some reason, and the period during which they're stopped and before they're started again is catastrophic for them. And I've lobbied the government hard about changing this system because it creates ripple chaos which goes on for a long time. Sometimes they're people who have huge difficulty simply managing their budgets. And one of the very few people I would wish to see food banks disappear, but a food bank should never just be a food bank. It should be a place where you can also get financial advice, and the best ones, in my experience, do exactly that and help people. I'm not complacent about this. We ought to live in a society where we can get away from food banks completely. But there will always be, however economically successful we are, however high the welfare payments that we start generating, there's always going to be a section of people who've a whole range of health issues, there's a wide range of reasons, are on the whole on the margins, and what they need is active support within the local community, and also a security and the welfare benefits that go to provide that.
Okay, final question, Dominic, and as someone who has sat in the House of Commons for 22 years, I'm very interested in your take on this. What do you think the role of an MP should be?
The primary role of an MP is a national legislator. That's what we're sent to Westminster to do. We're sent to scrutinise legislation, to argue over it, and to hold the government to account for its national policies. But it's also right to say that all over the last 50, 60 years, it wasn't the case before then. MPs have taken on a local community leadership role, which means that lots of problems get brought to their doorstep, which are not really about national government issues, but about the delivery of local services, in which they're being asked to act as a problem fixer. And it's a very valuable role because, quite apart from anything else, it does bring home to MPs what's going on the ground. If people are having problems getting passports, if they're having problems getting visas for relatives to come in from countries, if they're having problems with their welfare benefits or housing, or are complaining about the state of the road may be a county council highway matter. But of course, if you go and speak to the county, they will rightly point out, seeing we're spending 60% of our budget on adult and child social care, you shouldn't be surprised, Dominic, they'll say to me, that we haven't got money to fill the potholes. So I've actually found that role over the 22 years immensely rewarding. And I've always felt, as I've leave Westminster and come out here on a Friday, it's a bit like a sort of complete change of scene, but it's quite related to what I'm doing at Westminster. And I think MPs have got to fulfil both roles. And the public have understood that MPs are quite good at cutting through red tape. The risk is that we overpromise, because ultimately in the role we're fulfilling in constituencies, although we can lobby, we can cut through the red tape, we can sometimes unearth administrative misconduct or incompetence and get it remedied, we're not the principal policy makers. So one has to understand, and people have to understand, that MPs, particularly when they're asked about local issues, I always look a bit askance at MPs who promise that they will stop this or do that, because the truth is we don't have the power to do it. What we do have the power to do is to understand what the issue is and to try to steer those who are making the decisions in the right direction.
That's Dominic Grieve, who is standing as an independent candidate in the Beaconsfield constituency at the forthcoming general election on Thursday, the 12th of December. You are listening to Wycombe Sound's election special. You can hear all of the interviews that we've carried out with the candidates in Wycombe and Beaconsfield, as well as 2 roundtable discussions with those candidates on our website, which is wycombesound.org.uk. Coming up next, I will be speaking to Zoe Hatch, who is standing for the Green Party in the Beaconsfield constituency.